Good morning. My name is Laura Gomez, and I'm very honored and pleased to be able to moderate this panel and to welcome you to UCLA for this intellectual engagement that is inspired by my friend Cheryl Harris's article, germinal article, we might say, after the conversations yesterday, Whiteness as Property. If last night's panel was supposed to draw our attention to the moment of 1993 when Cheryl's article was published in the Harvard Law Review, or when notorious WAP was published, as my sister Belinda Tucker put it last night, this morning's plenary is designed to foreground the contemporary relevance that the article still has today, and in particular to show us how social movements, political alliances, various kinds of questions of racial ideology and racial justice continue to be influenced by Cheryl's work today. And other than saying that, I'm not going to rehearse the wonderful and lengthy description of the panel that's in your program. I'm going to say a few words of my own about Cheryl and about the article, and then I'm going to turn it over to this, I'm going to introduce your wonderful panel and turn it over to them for their comments. So I want to say a few words about my comadre, Cheryl. Comadre, if you don't know, is the Spanish word for the word that describes one dimension of our relationship, the fact that she is the godmother to my 17-year-old son, Alejandro. I first met Cheryl in 1995 over lunch at the UCLA Faculty Center. I think it was late fall, and it was probably already getting cold in Chicago. But we were sitting outside having lunch at the Faculty Center and trying to recruit Cheryl to come to visit, to do a visiting stint at UCLA. The Whiteness as Property article triggered visiting offers from UCLA, but also from the University of Chicago, and we were thinking, well, this might be hard. She's in Chicago. She was teaching at Chicago Kent at the time. She's a native of Chicago. She had a new baby at the time who's now fully grown and famous, but he was then just in diapers, and we were thinking, how are we going to be able to get her here? The sunshine eventually won out, and she turned down the Chicago offer to spend 2 years, 1996 to 1998, visiting here, and then became a permanent tenured member of this faculty in summer of 1998. And ever since, I've been close friends with her. I have sought her advice in matters of parenting and professional life. I have been her political ally on faculty politics issues that we cannot talk about. We will not talk about, at least at this particular moment. And it's been a great ride. I do want to say a few things about the article particularly, but I also want to just situate myself personally. And I want to do that because it's sometimes helpful for students, and in particular law students. So how many of you are students in the audience?
Nice.
So I will say this word of just contextualizing what I was thinking about in the early 90s, where I was, and how Cheryl's work influenced me, just to remind you that we look forward to you students becoming the legal academics and scholars in other fields as well of the future. So I was at Stanford between 1987 and 1992 working on a law degree and a PhD in political science, and I was there at a time when, for a variety of reasons that we could analyze in more detail, there were just a number of very exciting things going on. Peggy Radin was one of my teachers. Chuck Lawrence, at the back of the room, who you're going to hear from later today, was one of my teachers in race and American law. Visiting professors during the years that I was there included Rachel Moran, Angela Harris, Patricia Williams, Mari Matsuda. Permanent faculty members who mentored me included Jerry Lopez, Miguel Mendez, and it was this at Bill Hing, from whom I took immigration law and the immigration clinic, and it was just a tremendous time, and my mind was filled with these ideas of the growing critical race theory movement, and it was an incredibly exciting time for me to be there and for me to think about entering legal academia. So when I came to UCLA in 1993 to start my teaching career, this was the ferment that was in the air, and when I met Cheryl and read that article, it was truly sort of the crystallization of, I think, I felt like I was in the right place, I was doing the right thing, and it was just very meaningful in that way. So let me just talk a little bit, very briefly, about the article before I introduce my fellow panelist. So the legendary Derek Bell once singled out the three most important critical race theory articles. Chuck Lawrence's article, The Id, the Ego, and Equal Protection, which was published in 1987. Race, Reform, and Retrenchment, published a year later by my colleague and friend Kim Crenshaw. And Cheryl's Whiteness as Property article. Of course, as always, Derek was correct about the centrality of these three articles in the critical race theory canon. And upon rereading Cheryl's article after 2 decades, it is striking how well it stands the test of time, remaining deeply relevant today, as this panel will make crystal clear. But then again, I suppose you all knew that or you wouldn't be here with us this weekend. Cheryl opens the article with a moving vignette about her maternal grandmother, who for some years passed for white in order to support her family, obtaining work at a retail store that catered to whites in segregated Chicago. It reminded me of my own family history. For me, it resonated with a story told by a great uncle on my mother's side. He told me about registering for school in the West Texas town where his family had just moved. This is my maternal grandmother's sibling. Her family were cotton pickers, and they moved with the crops as they needed to, and for that reason, they were not frequently able to stay in the same town through the entire school year. So my great aunts and uncles didn't have the opportunity to go past elementary school in some cases, and this particular great uncle went up to 8th grade. He was the darkest of 7 siblings, and he told me that he was frequently in these towns of Texas mistaken for black. And for an academic reading which captures this era and the very interesting dynamics of cotton workers, cotton pickers in Texas being black, white, and Mexican, you should see Neil Foley's book. I highly commend it. So he went on to tell me that his father, my great-grandfather, was adamant every time they went to a new town about going to register his 2 youngest children, Theo Johnny and Thea Nellie, who's still alive at 86. She's my oldest living relative and the last surviving member of that generation. So their father would take them every time they entered a new town to go register at school, and he would make sure to take them to the white school to register and not the black school to register. I recall talking with Cheryl about this story at the time I met her in 1995, and in retrospect, Whiteness as Property and my conversations with her at that time laid the groundwork for my 2007 book, Manifest Destinies, The Making of the Mexican-American Race. The book is largely about a kind of group-level passing that Mexican Americans had access to in the late 19th and early 20th, and maybe even as far as the middle 20th century, as a group that was deemed legally white but socially non-white. And I have to make a confession to you here, and that is that it is a great embarrassment to me that I did not recognize, that I did not acknowledge the influence of Whiteness as Property on that book, in the book itself. I didn't consciously remember until reading the article the second time just recently how influential that had been in my trail and in leading me to that path. And so I'm especially delighted to be able to rectify that today by telling you, Cheryl, thank you for your influence and your leadership. And you are not responsible for any of the errors in the book, the misjudgments, the overclaiming, but for that, I think that seed that led me thinking along those lines in a way that I wasn't even fully cognizant of. So one more word about the book, and then I'm going to turn to our introduction. So I'm right on time, Charissa, and I just want to point out where our timekeeper is and how we're all going to be on time up here to save time for questions and comments. And how many of you, please be honest, how many of you have not read the article? Okay, so I'm assuming there's probably double that number, but it's like when I ask students, "Have you done today's reading?" Right? Okay, so read it. This will inspire you to read it. It's almost 100 pages with. If it had the footnotes were normal font like normal disciplines do and like law, it would be a book. It is a book, right? It deserves to be read. And I just want to say a few things about the sort of scope, especially for those people who didn't have the opportunity to be here last night and to hear about the article and it's really a wonderful panel to sort of hear a bunch of different sort of slices about the article. First is it was ahead of its time in its interdisciplinary approach, right? Cheryl drew heavily on history and in particular on the history of slavery in ways that really deepen our general knowledge, and it was fascinating to hear Robin talking about how the article became the most important law review article read by historians in the 90s, and not surprising. The second thing that the article does, and Peggy mentioned this last night, is has a very deep and thorough engagement with property doctrine and property theory. And again, even if it had just done those two things, we'd say, wow, fantastic law review, right? Great tenure piece. But it did more. She revises our understanding of the key civil rights cases, both in terms of Plessy and Dred Scott, but also in terms of Brown, and in particular, reminding us, convincing us, teaching us that Brown left intact the de facto white privilege that we continue to contend with today. It is a tour de force in terms of its discussion of affirmative action, one that remains very pertinent today, and one that, as Peggy was mentioning last night, was prescient in terms of projecting how the affirmative action doctrinal debates were going to be constricted and limited, and and sort of leaving us with this minimalist kind of notion of a diversity-based affirmative action, which Justice Sotomayor reminds us in her dissent in the Schuette case that it's not even appropriate to call it affirmative action, right? That she says, let's call it race-sensitive admissions. And then the fifth thing that the article did was it launched the contemporary, or the last 2 decades worth of studies of whiteness, right? That branched out from ethnic studies, but also into history. And this was, when you sort of look at the tremendous contributions of the article, you have to read it. You will enjoy it. You will learn from it. And I'm glad we're here discussing it. Okay, so.